The Three Musketeers by Alexandre Dumas. His steed was a pony from Gascony, a province of southwestern France. It was 14 years old, yellow in color, without a hair in its tail. It had been given to D'Artagnan by his father. The young man had hoped for something better, but his father had little to offer except advice. "My son," he had said, "the time has come for you to go out into the world to seek fame and fortune. I have taught you to handle a sword. You have arms of iron and a wrist of steel. Fight, then, as often as you can. I have nothing to give you but these 15 pieces of gold and a letter to my old friend Monsieur de Tréville in Paris. You would do well to follow his example." As a young man without fortune, he went to Paris to make his way in the world. Now he is captain of the Musketeers, whose duty it is to guard our king. It is said that even the great Cardinal Richelieu fears him. Go to him with this letter, and may you do as he has done. In the early evening of the first Monday of the month of April, 1626, he rode into the city of Meaux, a small town on the River Loire, en route to Paris. He was a good-looking young fellow, tall for his 19 years. His face was long and tanned, with high cheekbones and open, intelligent eyes. D'Artagnan stared fiercely into the eyes of the passers-by. He was by birth a Gascon, and the people of Gascony are famous for the quickness of their tempers. He was ready to take every smile as an insult and every look as a challenge. He jogged into the courtyard of an inn, swung down from the saddle, and looked round for a servant to lead his horse to the stable. Then it happened. There came a great shout of laughter. D'Artagnan turned on his heel and glared towards the inn. A man sat by an open window on the ground floor. He was about 40 years of age, with piercing black eyes, a pale skin, a strong nose, and a well-shaped moustache. Beside him sat two men who seemed to hang upon his words with great respect. Both were roaring with laughter. The stranger's eyes were on the yellow horse, and as D'Artagnan watched, he pointed at the beast and said something that made his companions laugh more loudly still. D'Artagnan did not like that laugh at all. The Gascon in him felt deeply insulted. His hand flew to the hilt of his sword, and he strode towards the window. "You, sir! You, who are hiding yourself behind that shutter. Yes, you, sir! Tell me what you're laughing at, and we shall laugh together!" The man raised his eyes from the horse and looked at D'Artagnan up and down. His lip curled. "I am not speaking to you, sir," he replied coldly. "But I am speaking to you," cried D'Artagnan. The unknown looked at him again with a slight smile, then left the window, came out of the inn with a slow step, and placed himself before the horse. D'Artagnan drew his sword a foot out of the scabbard, but the stranger ignored him and spoke loudly so that his friends at the window might hear. "This horse," he said, "must have been a buttercup in his youth. Yellow is a well-known color in botany, but till the present time very rare among horses." He turned on his heel and was about to re-enter the inn. D'Artagnan drew his sword from the scabbard and followed him, crying, "Turn! Turn, Master Joker, or must I strike you from behind?" "Strike me!" exclaimed the other, turning sharply. "Why, my good fellow, you must be mad." D'Artagnan made a furious lunge at him with his sword. The stranger sprang back, and in a second his own blade was in his hand. At the same moment, out of the inn rushed the stranger's two friends, the host, and several men-servants armed with sticks and shovels. They fell upon D'Artagnan before he had time to turn, and he was struck from two sides at once. One blow fell on his sword, and broke it in two, a second crashed down upon his head, and he sank to the ground with blood running down his face. The landlord, fearful of consequences, looked to the stranger as if for advice. "Take him inside and see to his wound," said the unknown coldly. "Then replace him on his orange horse, and let him be gone." At the sign from the landlord, the servants lifted the young man and carried him from sight. The stranger went back to his place at the window and calmly sat down once more. After some minutes, the innkeeper hurried into the room and asked if he were hurt. The stranger smiled. "I have met with no harm," he said. "How is the madman?" "I looked in his pocket," said the landlord. "There was a letter in it, addressed to Monsieur de Tréville in Paris." "There was? Where have you put the madman?" he asked. "Upstairs. My wife is dressing his wound." "Have you taken off his doublet?" "It's in the kitchen." "If this young fool annoys you, my lord—" "He does. Now call my servant and have my horse saddled at once." The landlord bowed and left. The stranger said softly to himself, "I should like to know what is in this letter for Tréville." Muttering to himself, he directed his steps towards the kitchen. When D'Artagnan recovered his senses, the innkeeper was standing by his bedside. "Young man," he said, "you have caused a lot of trouble. You are weak, I know, but I advise you to get up and depart as quickly as possible." D'Artagnan rose, started down the stairs, came to the foot of them, and through the open door he saw the stranger stand beside a horse, talking to a woman in a carriage. D'Artagnan saw at a glance that the woman in the carriage was young and beautiful. She was pale and fair, with long curls falling over her shoulders, had large blue eyes, rosy lips, and was talking eagerly to the unknown. "The cardinal then orders me," D'Artagnan heard her say, "to go at once to England," the stranger interrupted, "and to inform him as soon as the Duke leaves London." "And my other instructions?" she asked. "They are contained in this box, which you will not open until you are on the other side of the channel." D'Artagnan came forward with a rush. The stranger whirled round. His hand flew to the hilt of his sword, but the woman called out urgently, "Don't stop to fight! Remember that the least delay may ruin everything." "You are right," he said. "Let us both depart." He sprang into the saddle of his horse. The lady called to her coachman. The wheels of the carriage began to turn. The unknown went off at a gallop. "Coward!" cried D'Artagnan, springing forward. And then a faintness seized him, and he fell to his knees in the yard. "He is a coward indeed," grumbled the landlord, drawing near. "But she," muttered D'Artagnan, "she was very beautiful." "What she?" demanded the landlord. "Milady," said D'Artagnan weakly, and fainted right away. On the following morning at 5 o'clock, D'Artagnan arose and went to the kitchen. He was walking about that same evening, and on the next day felt strong enough to continue his journey. But when the time came to pay his bill, he found his father's letter to Monsieur de Tréville was missing. "Where is my letter?" "It is for Monsieur de Tréville. I warn you that if it is not found quickly, he will want to know the reason why." "Wait! Wait!" cried the landlord. "That letter has been stolen from you." "Stolen? By whom?" "The gentleman with whom you quarreled. I caught a glimpse of him going into the kitchen, where your doublet was. Maybe he has stolen it." "Do you think so?" asked D'Artagnan. "I'm sure of it," continued the host. "When I told him that you were a friend of Monsieur de Tréville's, because I had seen that letter in your pocket, he looked very worried. A little later, he went off to the kitchen." "Then that's my thief!" cried D'Artagnan. "I shall complain to Monsieur de Tréville. The king himself shall hear of it." The first thing he did when he reached Paris was to sell the horse for 3 crowns. He did so without regret. When that was done, he found lodging in a house near the center of the city. Before he went to bed that night, he mended his clothes and had a new blade put in the handle of his sword. Like young D'Artagnan, Monsieur de Tréville had come to Paris with no more to help him than a strong sword arm, a daring spirit, and keen intelligence. He became in time one of the few men the king could trust. Louis XIII had such confidence in the man's courage and wisdom that he appointed him captain of his own bodyguard. The Prime Minister of France at that time was Cardinal Richelieu, who vied with the king quite openly. Both men kept armed bodyguards. Each made every effort to secure for himself the finest swordsman in the world. The members of the king's bodyguard formed a legion of devil-may-care fellows who were all men of good birth and called the Musketeers. Richelieu's men were known as the Cardinal's Guard. The Cardinal had many enemies. One was the Queen herself, who objected to the Cardinal's great power and his influence over the king. Tréville was another. He took a delight in parading his musketeers before the Cardinal's eyes with an insolence that made his enemy's grey moustache curl with anger. From 6 o'clock each morning, the headquarters of Tréville had all the appearance of an armed camp. Musketeers, armed to the teeth and ready for anything, gathered there in full strength. D'Artagnan made his way through the crowd of men in the yard, past the great door, covered with long squared-headed nails, and found himself in the hall, surrounded by another crowd of swordsmen, some shouting and laughing together, others quarrelling noisily or playing tricks upon one another. He moved through them with a beating heart, and his long rapier bumped against his lanky leg. A musketeer came and asked him what he wanted, and promised to tell Tréville of his arrival. While he waited, the young man looked about him and listened to the talk of the men in the room. In the center of the noisiest group stood a musketeer of great height. D'Artagnan's eyes widened at the size of him. He was a mountain of a man. His expression was proud, and he wore a very fine belt worked in gold, which shone like water ripples in the sun. A long cloak of crimson velvet fell in graceful folds from his shoulders, showing in front the splendid belt from which hung a gigantic rapier. He had, he said, just come off duty, and complained of having a cold. He coughed hard from time to time, and explained that this was why he wore his cloak inside the house, a detail that had somehow surprised D'Artagnan. "How did you come to own such a fine belt, Porthos?" a musketeer asked. "I had it made specially," replied Porthos, twisting his magnificent moustache, "and I paid a great deal for it, didn't I, Aramis?" The musketeer, whom he called Aramis, was a dark young man of about 22, with black eyes, a small moustache, and a little pointed beard. He spoke little and laughed quietly. In answer to his friend's question, he merely nodded his head. "Monsieur de Tréville awaits Monsieur d'Artagnan," cried the servant, throwing open the door of the study so suddenly that D'Artagnan gave a big start of surprise. Everyone fell silent. In the hush, D'Artagnan walked across the room with all eyes upon him and passed through the open doorway. The captain of the Musketeers stood by an open window. He was very straight and tall. He had thick grey hair, a large hooked nose, and eyes that were as keen as a sword blade. He greeted the young man politely. D'Artagnan returned his greeting and bowed very low. "A moment, if you please," Tréville murmured and crossed to the door. "Athos," he shouted. "Porthos! Aramis!" The 2 musketeers, whom D'Artagnan had seen in the outer room, at once entered the study. Monsieur de Tréville glared from one to the other. "Do you know what the king said to me yesterday evening?" "No, sir," replied Porthos, "we do not." "He told me that in the future he would choose his musketeers from among the cardinal's guards." "From the cardinal's guards?" cried Porthos. "But why?" "Because his musketeers are cowards, it seems," snapped Tréville. The two musketeers reddened to the whites of their eyes. His Majesty was right. Last night, the cardinal told the king that certain of his musketeers had made a riot in one of the inns. The cardinal's guards had to arrest them. Arrest musketeers. You were among them. You were. Don't deny it. "I don't see Athos. Where is he?" "Sir," replied Aramis sadly, "he is very ill." "Ill? What's the matter with him?" "It may be smallpox, sir," said Porthos. "Smallpox? That's a fine story to tell me. I don't believe it. I will not have you brawling in the streets, not if you are to be laughed at by the cardinal's guards. Would they allow themselves to be arrested? They would rather die, I'm sure of it." Porthos and Aramis trembled with rage and bit their lips till the blood came. "Captain," cried Porthos, "the truth is that we were not captured by fair means. They took us by surprise. Athos was wounded, and two of our party killed before we had time to draw our swords. Athos tried twice to get up and fell again twice, so that the guards left him for dead. They dragged us away by force, but we managed to escape. I killed one of the guards with his own sword, for mine was broken early in the fight," put in Aramis. "I did not know that," said Tréville, more gently. The door opened, and a tall musketeer stepped into the room. His face was frightfully pale. "Athos," said Tréville. "You have sent for me, sir?" said Athos, in a feeble yet perfectly calm voice. Tréville sprang towards him. "I was about to say that I forbid my musketeers to risk their lives without good cause," he said, "for brave men are very dear to the king, who knows that his musketeers are the bravest men on earth. Give me your hand, Athos." He squeezed the musketeer's hand with all his might. Athos allowed a slight murmur of pain to escape him, grew paler than before, and suddenly toppled to the floor as if he were dead. "Fetch a surgeon," cried Tréville. "Mine, the king's, the very best. Quick, or my brave Athos will die." Athos was helped from the room. His friends went with him. D'Artagnan and Tréville were left alone. "Well, what do you want?" asked Tréville. D'Artagnan repeated his name, and Tréville remembered him at once. "I'm sorry," he said. "I had quite forgotten you. I knew your father. Well, what can I do for you?" "I came to ask," said D'Artagnan hesitantly, "that you would allow me to wear the uniform of Musketeer. But in the time I've been here, I have seen what a great honor that is." "You are right," agreed Tréville. "It is a great honor. No one becomes a musketeer until he has proved that he possesses unusual courage." D'Artagnan bowed. "Since your father was a friend of mine," continued Tréville, "I will do all I can for you. I shall write to the director of the Royal Academy, and tomorrow he will admit you without any expense to yourself. There you will be taught horsemanship and swordsmanship. Come from time to time and tell me how you're getting on." D'Artagnan was disappointed. He felt that Tréville was treating him a little coldly. "If only I had not lost the letter my father wrote you," he blurted out. "I had one, sir, but it was stolen from me." He then told of his adventure at Mans and described the unknown gentleman in detail. "This is all very strange," said Tréville thoughtfully. "You say that this gentleman had a scar on his face?" "Yes, sir, on his left cheek." "Do you know him? Tell me who he is, and where I may find him." Tréville was frowning. "Take care, young man," he warned. "If you see him on one side of the street, pass by on the other. Do not cast yourself against such a rock. He would break you like glass." He turned away. And now I must write that letter for you." While the letter was being written, D'Artagnan stood by the window, looking out over the court and into the street. Tréville had finished writing and was about to hand over the letter when the young man made a sudden leap for the door. "The thief!" D'Artagnan cried. "The man with the scar on his cheek! I have just seen him in the street!" And he disappeared. D'Artagnan crossed the antechamber in 3 bounds. He ran headfirst into a musketeer who was coming from another room, striking his shoulder violently. The man gave a cry of pain. "Excuse me," gasped D'Artagnan. "I'm in a great hurry." A hand of iron seized him by the belt and stopped him. D'Artagnan saw that it was Athos who held him. The man was as pale as a sheet. "So, you are in a hurry, are you? You run into me, say excuse me, and think that is enough." "I did not mean to run into you," cried D'Artagnan impatiently. "I apologize, and it seems to me that is enough. Be good enough to leave go of my belt." "Sir," said Athos, letting him go, "you are not polite. It is easy to see that you have come a long distance." D'Artagnan stopped short. "However far I may have come," he replied, "it is not for you to give me a lesson in good manners. If I were not running after someone, I'd miss the gentleman in a hurry." "You can find me without running after me," interrupted Athos calmly. "And where, may I ask?" said D'Artagnan. "Behind the Carmelite monastery at noon," said Athos. "I shall be there," said D'Artagnan. He streaked across the courtyard towards the gate where Porthos was talking with the musketeer on guard. As he was about to pass, the wind blew out Porthos's long cloak, and D'Artagnan ran straight into it. Instead of letting his cloak fly loose, Porthos tugged it towards him, so that D'Artagnan was trapped inside it. He fought to find his way from under the folds, wondering why Porthos should cling so closely to the cloak. Then he found himself with his nose fixed between the man's shoulders and his face pressed against the musketeer's sword belt. He knew then why Porthos had worn the cloak inside the house. His magnificent belt was a sham. It glittered with gold in front and was nothing but plain leather behind. D'Artagnan's head appeared under the arm of the giant musketeer. "Excuse me," he gasped. "I'm in a hurry. I'm running after someone, and do you always forget your eyes when you run?" demanded Porthos. "No," replied D'Artagnan, annoyed, "and thanks to my eyes, I can see what other people cannot." Porthos went red with anger. "Sir," he cried furiously, "you will be chastised if you rub against musketeers like this." "Chastised?" cried D'Artagnan. "That is a strong word, sir." "It is one that can be used by a man who is not afraid to look his enemies in the face," replied Porthos haughtily. "I know full well that you don't turn your back on yours," replied D'Artagnan, moving off and laughing loudly. Porthos foamed with rage and took a step after him. "I'll meet you later," the young man called over his shoulder, "when you haven't your cloak on." "At 1 o'clock behind the Luxembourg," called Porthos. "Very well, at 1 o'clock," replied D'Artagnan, turning out into the street. It was empty. However slowly the unknown had walked, he had gone on his way, and D'Artagnan could find no sign of him. Aramis stood further along the street, chatting to 3 friends. He spotted D'Artagnan approaching, but pretended not to see him. D'Artagnan, however, saw that Aramis had let his handkerchief fall and had placed his foot upon it. D'Artagnan stooped and dragged the handkerchief from under the musketeer's boot, in spite of the efforts made by the other to detain it. "I believe, sir," said D'Artagnan, "that this is a handkerchief you would be sorry to lose." The handkerchief was small and beautifully sewn. Aramis blushed and snatched it from him, but not before his friends had seen the coronet that was sewn in one corner. "Aha!" cried one, "you must be on good terms with Madame de Bois Tracy if she lends you her handkerchief." Aramis glared at D'Artagnan, then said lightly, This is not my handkerchief, gentlemen. See, here is mine, in my pocket. D'Artagnan now realized his mistake. The fact is, he said timidly, that I did not see it fall. Monsieur Aramis had his foot on it, that is all. I thought it must be his. D'Artagnan walked on a few paces, and waited until Aramis parted from his friends a moment later. Then he stepped forward and said, "Sir, you will excuse me, I hope." "Young man," replied the other sternly, "you have not behaved as a gentleman should." "What?" cried D'Artagnan. "Do you suppose I suppose you are not a fool, even though you come from Gascony, and know very well that people do not tread on handkerchiefs without a reason? Paris is not paved with handkerchiefs. Why did you so publicly hand it to me, so that a lady's name was brought into the conversation? Why did you so carelessly let it fall? I have said that it did not fall from my pocket. Then you lie, sir. I saw it fall." "Ah, you take that tone? Well, I must teach you how to behave yourself, it seems." D'Artagnan's hand sought the hilt of his sword. "Draw, if you please," he began. "Not here, not here, you fool," hissed Aramis. "I shall expect to meet you at the house of Monsieur de Tréville at 2 o'clock. "At 2 o'clock, agreed D'Artagnan, "and bring your handkerchief, whether it belongs to you or not. You may need it." The two men bowed and separated. When D'Artagnan arrived in sight of the open meadow that stretched along the foot of the monastery wall, he saw Athos already there. "I have asked 2 of my friends to act as seconds," said Athos, "but they have not yet come." "I have no seconds, sir, for I know no one in Paris," D'Artagnan explained. Athos studied the young man thoughtfully. "I shall be sorry to kill anyone as young as you are," he remarked. "Do not worry about that," replied D'Artagnan, "since you honor me by fighting while you suffer from a serious wound." "'Tis painful," Athos agreed, "but I must warn you that I fight as well with my left hand as with my right. I regret that I did not tell you sooner. Ah, here are my friends." D'Artagnan swung round and saw Porthos and Aramis approaching. "Are these your seconds?" he asked, wide-eyed. "Of course," replied Athos. "Don't you know that we are always together, and are called in the city the Three Inseparables?" By now Aramis and Porthos had come up and stood looking in some astonishment at D'Artagnan. "This is the gentleman I'm going to fight," said Athos. "What?" cried Porthos, amazed. "So am I." "But not before 1 o'clock," said D'Artagnan. "And I also am to fight with this gentleman," said Aramis, "but not until 2 o'clock," said D'Artagnan calmly. "Monsieur Athos has the right to kill me first, and may even do so. Now, sir, on guard." Scarcely had the 2 rapiers clashed, however, where they came the sudden thud of hoofs, and 5 horsemen cantered out of the trees along the meadow's edge and rode straight for the Musketeers. "The Cardinal's guards!" cried Aramis. "It's Jussac himself!" cried Porthos, as the horsemen drew rein some 20 paces off. D'Artagnan stared with interest at the tall, dark figure of their commander as he rode forward. So this was Jussac of the Cardinal's Guard, one of the first swordsmen in Europe. The man frowned heavily as he approached. "Fighting again, are you?" he cried. "You know that dueling is forbidden by law. It is my duty to stop you. Sheathe your swords and follow me." Porthos gave a roar of laughter and slapped his thighs hard. Aramis smiled. "Sir," he said, imitating Jussac's tone and manner, "we cannot do it. You must know that Monsieur de Tréville would not like us to be arrested. Leave us to our own affairs." "Unless you obey, we shall take you by force," said Jussac. "There are 5 of them and 3 of us," said Athos, half aloud. "If we are beaten, we must die here, for never again will I appear before my captain as a conquered man." D'Artagnan stepped towards the Musketeers. "Gentlemen," he said, "we are not 3, but 4. "You are not one of us," said Porthos. "If I have not the uniform," replied D'Artagnan, "I have the spirit. My heart is that of a musketeer. In a moment the air rang with the clash of steel as the blades struck. There was the sound of fierce breathing and the cries of men driven hard. Aramis found himself faced with two men at once, while D'Artagnan threw himself at Jussac. He fought like a furious tiger, attacking the older man on all sides at once. He turned 10 times round his enemy, leaping here and there with his long stride, changing his ground and his guard 20 times. Jussac found that it took all his skill to defend himself against a swordsman who obeyed none of the rules. He lost his temper, grew furious at being held in check by a mere boy. He sprang forward and aimed a terrible thrust. D'Artagnan parried it. And while Jussac was recovering himself, D'Artagnan glided like a serpent beneath his blade and passed his sword through his body. Jussac fell like a dead mass with a single loud groan. The wounded Athos was fighting bravely, but his face was very pale, and it was clear that he was weak from loss of blood. D'Artagnan sprang to his side, crying to the cardinal's man, "To me, Sir Guard, or I shall kill you!" The guard swung round to face D'Artagnan, and in that very moment, Athos sank upon one knee. "Do not kill him, D'Artagnan," he begged. "He's an old enemy, and I should like to finish him myself. Disarm him only. Make sure of his sword. That's it. Very well done." This exclamation was drawn from him by seeing the guardsman's swords fly 20 paces from him. D'Artagnan and the guard sprang towards the fallen sword that same instant, but D'Artagnan reached it first and placed his foot upon it. His opponent immediately ran to the guardsman whom Aramis had killed, seized his rapier, and returned towards D'Artagnan. But on his way he met Athos, who had recovered his breath, and who wished to continue the fight. In a few minutes the guardsman fell, with a sword thrust through his throat. At the same instant, Aramis placed his sword point on the breast of his fallen enemy and forced him to ask for mercy. Only Porthos fought against a man who seemed as skilled a swordsman as himself. The wounded Jussac, however, who had risen on his elbow, called out and commanded the man to stop. The man sprang back, broke his sword across his knee so that he need not surrender it, threw the pieces over the monastery wall, and crossed his arms, whistling a merry little tune. Bravery is always respected, even in an enemy. The musketeers saluted the man with their swords. Then, helped by the guardsman, still on his feet, they carried the wounded to the porch of the monastery, where they rang the bell and took their road back to the headquarters of the musketeers. A few hours later, the whole of Paris was talking about the fight between the musketeers and the guards. Monsieur de Tréville scolded his musketeers in public, but congratulated them in private. His first thought, then, was to hurry to the palace, so that he should be first to tell the king of the battle. He was too late. He found the king playing cards, and clearly in a good humor, because he was winning. "Come here, Captain," he called. "Do you know that the cardinal has been making fresh complaints against your men? These musketeers are fellows fit to be hanged." "No, sire," replied Tréville. "They are good fellows, and their one desire is to serve their king." "How did this incident happen?" asked the king. "3 of my best soldiers, Athos, Porthos, and Aramis, had made a party of pleasure with a young fellow from Gascony, and arranged to meet him behind the monastery. They were disturbed by Jussac and 4 other guardsmen, and I leave your majesty to judge what 5 armed men could possibly be going to do in such a place." "Aha," said the king, nodding. "There is no doubt they went there to fight themselves." "You are right, Tréville, I am sure of it. Saying my musketeers, they must have changed their minds, for as your majesty knows, the guards are the natural enemies of the musketeers." "You are right again, Tréville. But you say that your musketeers were not alone. They had a young man with them." "Yes, sire, and Athos was already weak from a wound, so that 2 fit men, a wounded man, and 1 youth were forced to fight against 5 skilled swordsmen, and, sir, they brought 4 of them to earth." "Why, this is a victory, a complete victory," cried the king, his eyes shining with delight. "Who is this youth who was there?" "His name, sir, is D'Artagnan. He is the son of one of my oldest friends. It was he who gave Jussac the terrible sword thrust which made the cardinal so angry." "He who wounded Jussac, one of the finest swordsmen in the kingdom? Tréville, that's impossible." "It is true, sire. Jussac, for once, found his master." "I should like to see this young man. It seems to me that he has proved his courage, and will make a worthy recruit to our musketeers. What do you think?" Tréville hesitated, and then said, "I like what I have seen of him. To make a musketeer of him now would mean that he would serve you to the death. Bring him to me tomorrow at noon." "Shall I bring him alone?" "No. Bring me all four together. I wish to thank them all at once. Such men are rare, and they must be rewarded. Come by the back staircase, Tréville. We must not let the cardinal know of this." D'Artagnan found himself following closely on the heels of Athos, Porthos, and Aramis as they walked into the room where the king awaited them. Come in, cried the king. He smiled at the four. "I'm going to scold you," the musketeers advanced, bowing, D'Artagnan following closely behind them. "4 of the cardinal's guards struck down in one day," said the king. "1 now and then I don't say much about, but 4 is too many." Tréville smiled. "Sire, they have come to offer you their excuses," he said. "By the look of their faces, I doubt that very much," replied the king. "Why, Tréville, you told me the Gascon was a young man. He's a boy, and you tell me that he defeated Jussac?" "Yes, sire." The king insisted that D'Artagnan should tell the story all over again. "Well," he said at the end, "you musketeers have taken your revenge. You should be satisfied now." "If you are satisfied, sir," said Tréville, "then so are we." The king smiled and said, "I should like to prove my satisfaction." He turned to Athos. "Tell me," he said, "are you and your friends planning to fight duels with Monsieur d'Artagnan, now that you have disposed of the cardinal's guards?" Athos looked shocked. "No, sire," he answered. "He has made himself one of us. Let us be known from now on as the 4 inseparables." The king looked at Monsieur de Tréville. "Well, Tréville," he said, "you had better take him and make a musketeer of him." D'Artagnan tried to stammer out his thanks, but the king raised a hand to stop him. He then called his valet, took from him a handful of gold, and put it into the hand of D'Artagnan. Now that he had money, his friends told him he must find himself a servant. Porthos said that he knew the very man, and that evening brought to D'Artagnan's rooms a young fellow from Picardy called Planchet. It was arranged that Planchet should receive 30 sous a day, and for a month, while the gold pieces lasted, he was as happy as a bird. When the gold was spent, however, he began to complain. "Be patient," D'Artagnan told him. "I look for better times in the future, and your fortune will be made if you remain with me." He then thrashed him thoroughly. One way or another, Planchet stopped complaining. One afternoon, someone tapped gently at D'Artagnan's door, and Planchet showed a stranger into his master's room. The visitor was a fat little man with a round face and beady eyes. "Monsieur d'Artagnan," the stranger began, "all Paris knows that you are a brave young man. I have come to ask for your help." "My help?" said the puzzled D'Artagnan. "My wife, sir, is a sewing woman to the queen," continued the little man. "She is young and of some beauty, and she was carried off yesterday morning as she was leaving her workroom." "Why? Who would do such a thing?" asked D'Artagnan. "I know nothing for certain, but there is someone I suspect, a creature of the cardinal's. He knows that my wife is close to the queen. Constance, my wife, you see, is a goddaughter of the queen's cloak-bearer, Monsieur Laporte. Cardinal Richelieu suspects the queen of plotting with England and Spain against our country. He has made her own life miserable, and the king suspicious of his wife. "How do you know all this?" D'Artagnan asked. "From my wife, sir. It seems that the Queen believes that someone has sent a letter in her name to the Duke of Buckingham in England. This would make the Duke come at once to Paris, because he has a great regard for our Queen. He will come and fall into the trap laid by her enemies, and the Queen will be accused of plotting with England against us." "And what has your wife to do with all this?" "They know that she is trusted by the Queen, and are holding her prisoner in order to obtain Her Majesty's secrets, or to make use of her as a spy." "That could be so," agreed D'Artagnan thoughtfully. "What is the name of this man who carried her off?" "I don't know. I only suspect. Constance pointed him out to me in the streets one day, and said that he was a man who served the cardinal. He's tall and very proud-looking, with black hair and eyes, and a scar on one cheek." "Tall, dark, a scar on his cheek? Why, this is my man of Meun!" cried D'Artagnan. "Where is he to be found?" "I have no idea." "I see. By the way, what is your name, sir?" "My name is Bonacieux." "Bonacieux? It has a familiar sound," said D'Artagnan, frowning. "It should have, sir," said the little man dryly. "I am your landlord, and I live in the rooms below. You hired these rooms through my agent, Monsieur Vernel, and that is why you have not seen me before. I have never asked you for rent, and I never shall, if you will find my wife for me. Reckoning still further that you may be short of money, I thought of offering to you this bag of gold to help with expenses." "Admirable," said D'Artagnan, taking the gold rather eagerly. Bonacieux raised a finger and pointed out of the window. "Look!" he cried. "What?" said D'Artagnan. "In the street, facing us. That man." "It is he!" cried D'Artagnan, recognizing the man of Meun. "And this time he will not escape me." On the staircase he met Athos and Porthos. "Where are you going?" Porthos called after him. "The man of Meun! That man! That man! The man of Meun!" shouted D'Artagnan over his shoulder. They sighed, raised their eyebrows, and continued up the stairs. D'Artagnan once again was too late. The man had gone, and the street was empty. When he returned home, he found that Aramis had also called, and his 3 friends were waiting for him. Bonacieux had left, but D'Artagnan told his friends of the little man's trouble. "Beware, D'Artagnan, beware," said Aramis, shaking his head. "You grow a little too warm about this young Madame Bonacieux. Woman was created for our destruction." "It is the Queen about whom I am most anxious," replied D'Artagnan hotly, "because it is said that she loves an Englishman, the Duke of Buckingham." "But it would not prevent me," said D'Artagnan, "if I knew where the Duke of Buckingham was, from taking him by the hand and leading him to the Queen, if only to annoy the cardinal." At this moment there came a sudden rush of feet upon the stair. The door was thrown violently open, and Bonacieux darted into the room, wild-eyed and fearful. "Save me!" he cried, darting behind D'Artagnan. "There are 4 men come to arrest me." Porthos came to his feet, his sword already half out of the scabbard. "Wait," D'Artagnan said. "It is not courage that is needed here. We must be careful. Let us see what we may learn from this." 4 men appeared in the doorway, but seeing 4 musketeers standing with swords at their sides, they hesitated. "Come in, gentlemen," called D'Artagnan heartily. "These are my rooms, and we're all faithful servants of the king and cardinal." Bonacieux was staring in anguish at D'Artagnan. "But you promised me," he whispered. "We can only save your wife if we are free ourselves," replied D'Artagnan in a low tone, and then loudly, "Do come in, gentlemen. I have no reason to defend Monsieur Bonacieux. I saw him today for the first time when he came to collect the rent. I should be glad to see him thrown into prison." The 4 men laughed with him. They were full of thanks. They seized hold of Bonacieux, and they dragged him from the room, loudly protesting his innocence of any crime. From that time on, the house of Bonacieux became a mousetrap. 4 or 5 of the cardinal's men had moved into the rooms below D'Artagnan's. Their duties were simple. They opened the door to all who knocked. It was closed after them, and they were held prisoner until they had told all that they knew of Bonacieux and his wife. D'Artagnan hit upon the idea of removing a plank from his floor so that nothing remained but a simple ceiling between him and the room below. On the evening of the day after the arrest of Bonacieux, a loud knocking was heard at the street door. The door was instantly opened and shut. Someone was caught in the mousetrap. D'Artagnan flew to his hole and lay down beside it. He could hear cries and moans and the sounds of a struggle. Then a woman cried out, "This is my husband's house. I'm Constance Bonacieux, and I belong to the Queen." Her cries went on, grew louder, and changed to heart-rending sobs D'Artagnan could bear no more. He came to his feet and called for his servant, Planchet. "Run," he said, "and find Porthos, Aramis, and Athos. Tell them to get here as quickly as they can." A second or two later, he was knocking at the door below. Steps approached, the door opened, and D'Artagnan pushed his way in, sword in hand. The door closed behind him. A minute or so after, the door of Bonacieux's house was thrown open, and 4 men flew out like so many frightened crows. Only one of these men had carried a sword, and having disarmed him in a moment, D'Artagnan sent him off with a thrust through the shoulder. The others had tried to knock the young man down with chairs, but 2 or 3 scratches made by D'Artagnan's blade had been more than enough for their liking. D'Artagnan found the young woman half fainting in an armchair. As he moved towards her, he saw on the floor the fine laced handkerchief which she picked up. In one corner was sewn the same coronet he had seen on the handkerchief which had nearly caused him and Aramis to cut each other's throats. From that time, D'Artagnan had been cautious with handkerchiefs that had arms sewn on them, and he therefore placed in the pocket of the young woman the one he had just picked up. As he stood back, she opened her eyes. She was, he thought, a most charming young lady, with dark hair, blue eyes, a nose that was slightly turned up. She smiled at him, and he thought she had the most beautiful smile in the world. "You are Monsieur D'Artagnan," she said. "I've seen you going to and fro. You have saved me. How can I thank you?" D'Artagnan bowed. "Madame," he said, "you owe me no thanks." "Where is my husband?" she asked, in a worried voice. "I'm sorry to say that he is in prison," replied D'Artagnan. "In prison? Why? What has he done?" "He is your husband, madame. That is why he has been arrested." "Oh, then you know." "Yes, yes. I know that you were carried off by a man with a scar on his cheek. How did you escape?" "I was shut up in a room not far from the palace. After dark, I let myself down from the window with the help of sheets and hurried here to find my husband." "And now, what are we to do?" asked D'Artagnan. "I don't know, sir," said Constance Bonacieux sadly. "There is no one I can trust. I wanted my husband to go to the palace for Monsieur Laporte, who is cloak-bearer to the Queen, but now I have no one to send." "You may trust me," said D'Artagnan eagerly. "You are a brave young man," said Constance Bonacieux, with another sweet smile. "Go to the palace and ask for Germain. He will ask you what you want, and you must answer Tours and Brussels. That's the password. Tours and Brussels. Tell him then that you wish to see Monsieur Laporte." Oh, she paused and looked worried. "Where shall you bring Monsieur Laporte to meet me?" "I'll take you to the rooms of my friend Athos," said D'Artagnan. They left the house, came to the lodging of Athos, who was not at home. When D'Artagnan came down the stairs, he heard the door closed and double-locked behind him. In a few minutes he was at the palace. When Monsieur Laporte was brought to him, he informed him where Constance Bonacieux was to be found, and the cloak-bearer set off at a run. D'Artagnan left the palace and walked for some time beside the river, thinking of Constance Bonacieux. Later, he turned his steps in the direction of the street in which Aramis lived. As he turned into the street, he saw a woman walking ahead of him. She stopped before the house of Aramis. She then gave a little cough, which the young man took to be a signal. He drew back, curious to see what would happen. The woman tapped 3 times on the shutter of a ground-floor window. A moment's pause, and then 2 sharp taps were heard inside. The woman in the street replied by a single tap, and the shutter was open. D'Artagnan had eyes like a cat. He saw the woman take a handkerchief from her pocket and show a corner of it to someone inside. There came a low murmur of voices. D'Artagnan crept nearer. He saw to his surprise that it was a woman who spoke to the figure in the cloak. Then the shutter closed. The woman in the cloak turned and passed within 4 paces of D'Artagnan, pulling her hood over her face. She was too late. D'Artagnan had already recognized Constance Bonacieux. When he put a hand on her shoulder, she sank upon one knee, crying in a choking voice, "Kill me, kill me, I will tell you nothing." D'Artagnan raised up. "Oh, Madame Bonacieux! Oh, it's you!" she exclaimed. "Did you follow me here?" "No," said D'Artagnan. "I came to visit my friend Aramis, and saw you knocking at his window." "Aramis? Who is he?" "You must know him," said D'Artagnan. "I've never heard of him. It's the first time I have been to that house," she said. "You didn't come to visit him?" "Certainly not. You must have seen that I spoke to a woman. But who is she?" "That is my secret." "Madame, you are charming, but at the same time you are a most mysterious woman." "Perhaps so," replied Constance Bonacieux with a smile. "Now stop asking questions and take me where I am going." D'Artagnan offered his arm, walked with her to a certain street, where she seemed to hesitate as she had done before. At last she seemed to recognize a door, and paused before it. She held out her hand. "Thank you for your help," she said. He bowed and walked away. When he reached the corner of the street, he turned. Constance Bonacieux had disappeared inside the house. D'Artagnan continued on his way, decided, go home. As he climbed the stairs to his rooms, he met his servant Planchet descending, looking very worried. "What has happened?" asked D'Artagnan. "Sir, Monsieur Athos has been arrested by the Cardinal's guards." "Athos arrested? What for? He was caught here at your lodging. They took him for you." "What? He didn't tell them his name?" "He would not, sir. He whispered to me, 'It is your master who needs his liberty at this moment, for he knows everything, and I know nothing of this affair. In 3 days' time I shall tell them who I am, but till then they shall think they have arrested D'Artagnan.'" "How noble! How like Athos!" cried D'Artagnan. "But what of Porthos and Aramis? I couldn't find them, sir." "You left word that I was waiting for them?" "Yes, sir." "If they come, tell them what happened. Let them wait for me at the Fur-Coned Cabaret." D'Artagnan hurried to Tréville's house, where he learned that the captain of the Musketeers was at the palace. As he neared the great building, he saw in front of him a woman in a black cloak and a man in the uniform of a musketeer. The woman was Constance Bonacieux, and he had not gone another 20 steps before he was convinced that the man was Aramis, though he held a handkerchief over his face. D'Artagnan was filled with anger and jealousy. He walked quickly past the couple, then turned to meet them. The man drew back a step. "What do you want, sir?" he asked suspiciously. He spoke with a foreign accent that took D'Artagnan by surprise. "It is not Aramis," he cried. "No, sir, it is not," replied the other sharply. "You mistake me for someone else. Allow me to pass, since you do not know us." "Take my arm, madame," he said, "and let us go our own way." He pushed D'Artagnan aside with his hand. That was enough. D'Artagnan made a spring backwards and drew his sword. At the same time, and with the speed of lightning, the unknown drew his. My lord, cried Constance Bonacieux, throwing herself between the two. D'Artagnan was struck by a sudden thought. "My lord," he repeated in amazement, "you are not—" "My lord, the Duke of Buckingham," said Constance Bonacieux in an angry whisper, "and you are likely to be the death of us all." "I ask 100 pardons," said D'Artagnan humbly. "How can I risk my life to serve your grace?" Buckingham smiled and held out his hand. "You are a brave young man," he said. "Follow us at a distance of 20 paces, as far as the palace, and if anyone watches, kill him." D'Artagnan placed his naked sword under his arm and followed behind until the Duke of Buckingham and Constance Bonacieux entered the palace by a little wicket gate. Then, with his head in a whirl, he hurried off to the cabaret of the Fur Comb. Meanwhile, Constance and the Duke of Buckingham entered the palace without difficulty. Constance led the Duke across the courtyard, then pushed at the little servant's door. The door yielded. She took the Duke by the hand and began to climb a narrow stair. At the top, she opened the door and pushed the Duke into a room lighted only by a night lamp. "Remain here, my lord," she said. "Someone will come." She went out by the same door, locking it behind her. The Duke of Buckingham knew that he had been lured from England by a pretended message from the Queen, that when he had journeyed to Paris, he was caught in the Cardinal's snare. He knew also that every second he remained in France, his life was in danger. But his love for the Queen was so great that he had refused to return to England without seeing her. The Duke, left alone, walked towards a mirror. As he smiled at his own reflection, the door opened and a woman appeared. It was the Queen. He turned to her and was, as always, dazzled by her beauty. She was then 26 years of age. Her eyes were as brilliant as emeralds, her mouth small and rosy. Her skin was of velvety softness, and her thick chestnut hair curled closely to her head. As she came forward, the Duke of Buckingham dropped on one knee, took her hand, and raised it to his lips. "You know that it is not I that sent for you," asked the Queen breathlessly. "Yes, madame," he replied, "but I have lost nothing by my journey, because I see you now." "Do you not understand," cried the Queen, "that you risk your own life and my honor? I have come only to tell you that we must never see each other again." "In 3 years, madame," Buckingham replied, "we have met only 4 times. Do you not remember an evening in the gardens of Amiens?" "Never speak of that evening," said the Queen, blushing. "I can never forget it," said Buckingham, rising to his feet. "That night you loved me, I swear it." Perhaps, replied the Queen sadly. "But all that is past and gone. I am now the Queen of France, and you must leave this country at once. You must go now, I beg you. Give me something that you have worn, a ring, a necklace, a chain, that I may wear it and remember you by it." "Will you go back to England if I give you what you ask?" "Yes, at once, I swear it." "Wait, then, wait." The Queen went from the room and came back almost immediately. Holding a rosewood casket in her hands, she offered it to the Duke of Buckingham. He took the casket and fell a second time on his knees. The Queen stretched forth her hand, her eyes closed. Buckingham kissed her hand and rose. "I shall see you again, madame, even if I have to overturn the world," he said, and went from the room. Bonacieux had been locked in a cell of the Bastille, the most dreaded prison in France. On the morning of the second day, he heard the bolts drawn and rose trembling from his bed of straw. He was taken up a flight of stone stairs along a stone corridor, where his guards opened a door and pushed him into a low room. The only furniture was a table and a chair. A police officer was seated in the chair and writing at the table. The officer looked up. He had a long face, a sharp nose, and small, keen eyes, like a fox. "You are accused of high treason," he said. "Sir," he cried, "it is not true." "Why, then, did you visit Monsieur d'Artagnan?" "To ask him to help me find my wife. I thought I had a right to find her. If I was wrong, I ask your pardon." "Monsieur d'Artagnan put to flight the police who had arrested your wife and has hidden her somewhere. Fortunately, we have since arrested d'Artagnan, and you will have an opportunity of seeing him at once." The officer turned and called, "Bring in Monsieur d'Artagnan." A minute or two later, the guards led in Athos. Bonacieux stared with starting eyes. But that is not d'Artagnan," he burst out. The police officer looked from one to the other. Not D'Artagnan, he said. What is this man's name, then? I cannot tell you, I don't know, said Bonacieux. The officer looked at Athos. Your name? He demanded. Athos, said Athos. But you said it was D'Artagnan. I did not. Somebody said to me, you are Monsieur D'Artagnan. I answered, you think so? The guards replied that they were sure of it, so I did not argue with them. D'Artagnan is a much younger man, cried Bonacieux excitedly. Yes, that's true, muttered the officer, looking more confused than ever. Athos wrinkled his nose in disgust. Ha! He said, if you have no more need of me, send me somewhere else. If it be Monsieur D'Artagnan who is concerned in this matter, I do not perceive how I can take his place. However, he could not persuade the officer to release him, so maintaining his peaceful indifference, he waited until Monsieur de Tréville learned of his plight and acquired an order for his release from the king. As for Bonacieux, he was locked in his dungeon once more. About 9 in the evening, he heard steps in his corridor. The door was thrown open, and his guards appeared again. Bonacieux was taken out into the courtyard and put into a carriage that was driven for some miles through the streets of Paris. They are taking me to be hanged, thought Bonacieux, and fell fainting to the carriage floor. The carriage continued to thread its way through the streets of Paris, turned into the Rue des Bons Enfants, and stopped before a low door. The door opened. 2 of the guards took Bonacieux in their arms and carried him, more dead than alive, up a flight of stairs and into a study filled with books and maps. In front of a fire stood a man of middle height, with piercing eyes, a thin face, set off by a grey beard and moustache, and all the appearance of a soldier. Is this Bonacieux? He asked. Yes, sir, replied the officer. Good. You may leave us. The officer and the guards withdrew. You are accused of high treason, said the grey-haired man slowly. You have plotted with your wife and the Duke of Buckingham. Sir, I swear to you that I know nothing about it, cried Bonacieux. I have heard my wife speak of the Duke of Buckingham. She said that Cardinal Richelieu had drawn the Duke of Buckingham to France to ruin him and to ruin the Queen. She said that? The man exclaimed, and he looked very angry. Tell me a few things about your wife. Whenever you went to fetch her from the palace, did you always return straight home? Hardly ever, sir. She always had business with the linen drapers, to whose houses I took her. There were 2 of them. And where did they live? One in the Rue de Vaugirard, number 25, the other in the Rue de la Harpe, number 75. The man with the grey beard was silent for a moment. Then he took up a silver bell and rang it. The officer entered. Bring Monsieur de Rochefort here at once, he said. Yes, Your Eminence, said the officer, bowing. Your Eminence, thought Bonacieux, this then is the Cardinal himself. A few seconds later, the door opened to admit a tall, dark man. It is he, cried Bonacieux excitedly. That's the man. What man? Asked the Cardinal sharply. The man who stole away my wife. The Cardinal rang a second time. The officer reappeared. Take away that fool, said the Cardinal sharply. Bonacieux was led from the room. The tall, dark stranger approached the Cardinal eagerly and said, They have seen each other. Where? Said the Cardinal. At the palace. Who told you of it? Our good friend, Madame de Lannoy. Tell me what happened. Madame de Lannoy says that at 12:30 the Queen was in her bedroom, and someone brought her a handkerchief from her sewing-woman. The Queen turned pale at the sight of it and said, Wait for me, ladies. I shall return in 10 minutes. She returned to fetch a casket from her room. When she came back again, she had no casket with her. What was in this casket? Asked Richelieu. It contained the diamond studs which His Majesty gave the Queen on her birthday, Rochefort replied. And the Queen gave these to Buckingham? Madame de Lannoy is sure of it, said Rochefort. Do you know where Buckingham is hidden? Asked the Cardinal. No, My people have not been able to find out. I think I know, said the cardinal, or at least I may guess. Take 10 of my guardsmen and search 2 houses, number 25, Rue de Vaugirard, and number 75, Rue de la Harpe. Is the Duke of Buckingham to be arrested? It will be too late. He will be gone, but we can make sure that it is so. I go, sir, and Rochefort went hastily from the room. The cardinal reflected for an instant, and then rang the bell for a 3rd time. The same officer reappeared. Bring the prisoner in again, the cardinal ordered. Bonacieux was led in once more. You have deceived me, said the cardinal sternly. Oh, no, sir, cried Bonacieux, looking shocked. Your wife never did go to call upon linen drapers. She went to meet the Duke of Buckingham. Your Eminence is right, cried Bonacieux, but I was too simple to realize the truth. Sir, how truly you are the great cardinal who knows all that goes on. A strange smile played over the cardinal's lips. He offered his hand to Bonacieux. I have been mistaken in you, my friend, he said simply. You are a very worthy man. I have touched the hand of the great man, cried Bonacieux. The great man has called me his friend. Yes, my friend, yes, said the cardinal. As you have been unjustly suspected, I shall be glad if you will accept this purse of 100 gold pieces and pardon me for my mistake. I pardon you, sir, said Bonacieux. You cannot mean that. Ah, my dear Bonacieux, you are generous in this matter. Come now, take this purse, and I hope you will go away without thinking too badly of me. Sir, I go away greatly honored at having touched your hand, he said. Farewell, then. I hope that we shall meet again. Whenever your Eminence wishes, I am always at your service. The cardinal turned again to the study of the papers upon his table. As he was in the deepest of his meditations, the door opened and Rochefort returned. Well, said the cardinal eagerly. Too late, replied Rochefort. He is gone. Then it is in London he must be found, said the cardinal. A messenger must take a letter to England. He sat down at his table and wrote quickly. Milady, be at the first ball at which the Duke of Buckingham is present. He will wear on his doublet 12 diamond studs. Get as near him as you can and cut off 2. Inform me as soon as these studs are in your possession. 8 days later, the cardinal received a letter which contained these few lines. I have them, but am unable to leave London for want of money. Send me 500 gold pieces, and 4 or 5 days after I have received them, I shall be in Paris. Signed, Milady. The cardinal smiled. He went at once to the king, talked for some minutes of affairs of state, and then, a little hesitantly, he said, Sire, I know that the queen has always looked upon me as her enemy, although your majesty knows that I have always taken her part warmly, even against you. I am also aware that recently there have been difficulties between yourself, sire, and the queen. May I venture to suggest that we do something which will be agreeable to her? The king stared in some astonishment. What have you in mind? He asked. Would it not please the queen, said Richelieu, if you were to give a ball in her honor? A ball, said the king. But you know that I do not approve of worldly pleasures. Then, sire, Her Majesty will be all the more delighted if you arrange something especially for her. It will give her an opportunity to wear those beautiful diamond studs which you gave her on her birthday. We shall see, said the king thoughtfully. We shall see. Have you a date in mind for this ball? The cardinal made a quick calculation in his head. Today is the 20th of September, he said. The aldermen of the city give a fete on the 3rd of October. That, I think, would be a most suitable day. Be sure to tell Her Majesty that you would like to see how her diamond studs become her." It was the second time the cardinal had mentioned the diamond studs, and the king was struck with his insistence. When the queen was alone in her room, the king told her of the plan he had in mind. "On the evening of this ball," he concluded, "I wish you to wear the diamond studs I gave you on your birthday." The queen grew pale, looked at her husband with terror in her eyes. The king saw her embarrassment and wondered at it. "You hear, madame?" he asked. "Yes, I hear," stammered the queen. "You will appear at this ball wearing my studs?" "Yes, yes," said the queen. Her paleness, if possible, increased. "Then that is agreed," said the king, turning away. "On what day will this ball take place?" asked the queen. "Oh, very shortly, madame. I will ask the cardinal." It was the cardinal, then, who wished me to appear at the ball with the diamond studs. Yes, it was the cardinal. The queen made a curtsy, largely because her knees were sinking under her, and the king left her alone to her thoughts. "Can I be of service to your majesty?" said a voice full of sweetness and pity. The queen turned sharply. Behind her stood Constance Bonacieux, who had been arranging the dresses in a closet when the king entered. She could not get out, and had heard all that had been said. "Fear nothing, madame," said the young woman. "We must get back these diamond studs. Someone must be sent to the Duke of Buckingham. If you will trust me, I will find the messenger. Write only 2 words on a piece of paper, and I shall see that your message is delivered. And if these 2 words should fall into the hands of my enemies?" asked the queen. "Trust me, madame, to see that they don't. I shall give your note to my husband. In fact, no one would suspect him of carrying the message of his queen. He will set out for England without knowing it himself," answered Constance Bonacieux. The queen took the young woman's hands and gazed at her as if to read in her very heart. "Yes," she said at last, "you are to be trusted." The queen ran to a little table on which were ink, paper, and pen. She wrote 2 lines and sealed the letter. "You will need money also," she said, pulling at her finger. "Here, take this ring. It is of great value. Raise money with it, and let your husband set out at once." 10 minutes afterwards, Constance Bonacieux was at her husband's house. It was 8 days since she had seen him. "There is something you must do for me, and you will be very well paid for it," she said. Bonacieux licked his lips. "How much?" he asked. 1,000 gold pieces, perhaps. "Now listen, this is what you have to do. You must leave Paris immediately. I will give you a paper which you must not part with on any account, and which you will deliver in the proper hands." "But where am I to go?" "To London." "I go to London? You are joking. I have no business there." "You are being sent by an illustrious person." "Aha!" cried Bonacieux. "More of your plots, I see. Thank you, my dear. I know all about you now. The cardinal has told me much of your intrigues." "The cardinal?" said Constance Bonacieux, staring. "Have you seen the cardinal?" "He sent for me," answered the husband proudly, "and he called me his friend. Do you hear that?" "You serve the cardinal?" whispered Constance Bonacieux. "Yes, and I am well paid for it," replied Bonacieux, slapping a plump, round bag. "What do you think of this, my dear? It is a gift from the cardinal." Constance saw that she had gone too far and was terrified at having told so much. "Well, perhaps you are right," she said. "Let us say no more about it." "Well, you might at least tell me what I should have to do in London," replied Bonacieux, eager to have news for the cardinal. "Oh, it was nothing much," said Constance carelessly. "It was about one of those purchases that interest women, but by which you might have gained something for yourself." The more she excused herself, the more important Bonacieux thought the secret which she now withheld from him. He decided that he should go at once to the cardinal and tell him that the queen was seeking for a messenger to send to London. "My dear," he said suddenly, "I'm afraid I must leave you for a while. I've no idea you would come this evening, and I've made an appointment. You are not angry with me, I hope?" "Of course not," said Constance Bonacieux. Bonacieux kissed his wife's hand and set off at a quick pace. "What shall I do?" said Constance. "I've failed my poor mistress. She will take me for one of those miserable wretches who are placed about her as spies." At the moment she spoke these words, there came a sharp rap on the ceiling. She raised her head, and a voice said, "Madame Bonacieux, open the little door on the alley for me, and I will come down to you." "Madame," said D'Artagnan, entering by the door which Constance Bonacieux opened for him, "allow me to say that you have a bad sort of husband." "You overheard our conversation?" she asked. "Yes, every word of it." She told D'Artagnan the terrible secret of the queen and the diamond studs. When she had finished, D'Artagnan stretched himself to his full height. "I will go to London at once," he said. "If I'm taken while attempting the orders you give me, I will die sooner than speak one word of what you tell me." "You have perhaps no money," said Constance, smiling. "My poverty is beyond question," said D'Artagnan. Constance Bonacieux opened a cupboard and took from it the very bag which a half-hour before her husband had caressed so affectionately. "You had better take this, then," she said, and explained whence it came. "The cardinals!" cried D'Artagnan, breaking into a loud laugh. "It will be doubly amusing to save the queen with the cardinals' money." "Silence!" said Constance Bonacieux. "What?" said D'Artagnan. "Someone is talking in the street." "It's the voice of my husband!" "Quickly!" said D'Artagnan, seizing her hand. "He must not find us here." They crept up the stairs and entered D'Artagnan's rooms. They approached the window, and through a slit in the shutter they saw Bonacieux talking with a man in a cloak. A ray of light from a lamp on the other side of the street fell upon the face of the stranger. D'Artagnan started, half drew his sword, and sprang towards the door. The man in the cloak was the man of Meung. "What are you going to do?" cried Constance. "You will ruin us all." "But I have sworn to kill that man," replied D'Artagnan fiercely. "Your life now belongs to the queen," Constance Bonacieux whispered urgently. "In her name I forbid you to throw yourself into any danger. Listen, listen, I heard my name. They're speaking of me." Reluctantly, D'Artagnan moved back towards the window. Bonacieux had opened his door, and seeing his house empty, had returned to the man in the cloak. "She is not there," he said. "She must have returned to the palace." "Is the young musketeer at home?" asked the man of Meung. "No, his shutter is closed, and there's no chink of light shining through," answered Bonacieux. "Let us go into your house. We'll be safer there than in the doorway," said the man of Meung. said Constance regretfully. "We shall hear no more." "On the contrary," said D'Artagnan, "we shall hear better." He raised 3 boards in the middle of the room, spread a carpet on the floor, went down on his knees, made a sign to Constance to join him. As she stooped down, she heard a voice speaking from below. "Now tell me, did your wife mention any names?" "No. She said only that she wished to send me to London to serve the interests of an illustrious personage." "The traitor!" murmured Constance Bonacieux. "Silence!" said D'Artagnan, taking her hand, which, without thinking of it, she abandoned to him. "You were a fool not to have pretended to accept the mission," continued the man. "You would then be in possession of the letter." "There is yet time," said Bonacieux eagerly. "The ninny," murmured Constance Bonacieux. "Silence!" said D'Artagnan, pressing her hand more closely. "I go to the palace," said Bonacieux. "I ask for Madame Bonacieux. I say that I have changed my mind. I obtain the letter, and I run directly to the cardinal." "Well, go quickly." The man of Meung went out. "Infamous!" hissed Constance in D'Artagnan's ear. "Silence!" said D'Artagnan, pressing her hand more warmly still. A terrible howling came from below. Bonacieux had discovered the loss of his money-bag. "Thieves! Thieves!" he was crying. A minute later, he rushed from the house. "Now we must go," said Constance Bonacieux. "Courage, my friend, but above all, caution. Remember that it is the queen you serve." "Her and you," said D'Artagnan. "I shall become worthy of her gratitude, but shall I likewise return worthy of your love?" The young woman only replied by the beautiful glow which mounted to her cheeks. D'Artagnan hurried to the house of Athos, where he found the three Musketeers gathered. "Gentlemen," said D'Artagnan, "we must go to London." The others stared at him in some astonishment. "To London?" cried Porthos. "What the devil shall we do there?" "I am not at liberty to tell you, gentlemen. You must trust me. We ride in the service of the Queen. The Cardinal, I have good reason to believe, will do everything in his power to stop us reaching the coast. I must warn you, gentlemen, that this is likely to be a dangerous adventure." "Could we ask more than to strike a blow at the Cardinal?" said Athos with a smile. "When are we to go?" "At once," replied D'Artagnan. "This is my plan, gentlemen. We will take our 4 servants, for they are good, stout fellows. I am the bearer of a letter. The letter is here in this pocket. If I should be killed, one of you must take it and go on. If he is killed, it will be another's turn, and so on. Should only one of us reach London, it will be enough. Gentlemen, is it agreed?" "It is agreed," shouted the 3 Musketeers. All went well till they reached Chantilly about 8 o'clock in the morning. They needed breakfast and dismounted at the door of an inn. They entered the common hall and sat down at a table. A gentleman who sat nearby made some remark about the weather, and the travellers replied. When they had eaten, the 4 rose. "One moment, my friends," called the stranger, "before you go. Join me in a toast to Cardinal Richelieu." "Certainly," replied Porthos, "if you will drink the king's health with me." The stranger glared. "I acknowledge no other king but his eminence," he cried, starting to his feet. Porthos placed his hands on his hips and laughed in the fellow's face. "Then you are either drunk or a fool," he said calmly. The stranger swore and drew his sword from his scabbard. "You cannot draw back now," said Athos to Porthos. "We will leave your servant behind. Hurry up and kill this fellow and follow after us." As the other 3 mounted their horses, they heard the clash of steel through a window of the inn. Then they set spur to flank and galloped off along the road. "There goes one," shouted Athos as they rode. Some 20 miles on, they came to where 8 or 10 men were filling the holes in the road with stones. As he rode by, Aramis had his clothes splattered with mud by one of them, and paused to speak sharply to the man. Instantly there came a loud whistle. The men ran for a ditch, from which each took a concealed musket. "It's an ambush!" shouted D'Artagnan. "Ride on!" They urged on their horses, crouching low in the saddle as the musket balls whipped and whistled about them. D'Artagnan's hat was carried from his head. There came a cry from Aramis. He had received a ball in the shoulder, but he seized the mane of his horse, which carried him on with the others. D'Artagnan called a halt a mile further on, did what they could to staunch the flow of blood from Aramis's wound, then continued at their best speed for 2 more hours, by which time the horses were so fatigued that it was clear they could not travel many more miles that day. Aramis, too, had grown very pale, and they were obliged to support him on his horse. They lifted him off at the door of the first inn they came to, and left him there with his servant. "Only 2 masters and 2 servants left," said Athos, as he and D'Artagnan rode on. They rode hard, reaching Amiens at midnight, and dismounting at the Inn of the Golden Lily. The landlord had only 2 rooms to offer, he said, and they were at the opposite ends of the inn. D'Artagnan and Athos refused them. They would sleep in the common hall, they said, on mattresses placed upon the floor. "The man is too polite," was D'Artagnan's opinion of the landlord. He had Planchet sleep on a bundle of straw at the door of the hall to guard them through the night. Grimaud, the servant of Athos, slept in the stable beside the horses, with orders to be ready at 5 in the morning. At 4 in the morning they heard a terrible riot in the stables. Grimaud had tried to waken the stable boys, who beat him with pitchforks. Planchet ran into the yard and found Grimaud stretched senseless on the ground. The horses were all used up and unfit to continue the journey. Athos and D'Artagnan now had no doubt that all this was part of some plot against them. Planchet was sent to inquire if there were horses for sale in the neighborhood. At the door stood 2 horses, fresh, strong, and fully equipped. He asked where their masters were, and was told that they had passed the night at the inn, and were then settling their bill with the host. Athos went to pay their own bill, while D'Artagnan and Planchet stood at the street door. The host was in the back room, seated behind his desk. He took the coins which Athos handed him, turned them over and over in his hands, and peered at them suspiciously. Suddenly he cried out that the coins were bad, and that he would have Athos and his companion arrested as forgers. "You blackguard!" cried Athos, stepping towards him. "I'll cut your ears off!" At the same instant 4 men, armed to the teeth, entered by the side door and rushed upon Athos. "D'Artagnan," he shouted at the top of his voice, "I'm taken! Get out of here quickly!" And he fired 2 pistols. D'Artagnan and Planchet did not need telling twice. They unfastened the 2 horses that were waiting at the door, leaped into the saddle, buried their spurs in their sides, and set off at a full gallop. They urged the horses forward and rode fast on the last stage of their journey to the coast. When they were only a few hundred paces from the gates of Calais, D'Artagnan's horse gave out, and could not be made to get up again. The blood flowed from his eyes and his nose. Planchet's horse remained on his feet, but refused to move another step. They left the horses upon the high road and ran towards the quay. D'Artagnan sailed an hour later, having sent Planchet back to Paris. The ship was scarcely a mile out to sea when he saw a flash from the port, followed by the crash of a cannon. It was the gun which announced the closing of the port. Too late. D'Artagnan was worn out with fatigue. A mattress was laid upon the deck for him. He threw himself upon it and fell asleep. Next morning, at break of day, they were in sight of the English coast. At 10 o'clock, the vessel dropped anchor in the harbour of Dover. At 10:30, D'Artagnan took horse and set out at the gallop. Only a few hours later, he rode into the streets of London. D'Artagnan wrote the name Buckingham on a piece of paper, and everyone pointed out to him the way to the Duke's great mansion. He arrived there only to be informed by the Duke's valet, who spoke perfect French, that his master was at Windsor hunting with the king. D'Artagnan said that he had come from Paris on an affair of life and death, and that he must speak with the Duke immediately. The valet ordered 2 horses to be saddled and rode as guide to the young Frenchman. On their arrival at Windsor Castle, they learned that Buckingham and the king were hawking in the marshes 2 or 3 miles away. In 20 minutes they were on the spot named. "Whom shall I say wishes to see my lord?" asked the valet. "The young man who sought a quarrel with him in Paris," answered D'Artagnan. "A singular introduction," said the man, and galloped off to find the Duke. Within a few minutes, Buckingham rode up to D'Artagnan. He opened the letter with fingers that trembled. His face paled as he read. "Patrick," he called to the valet, "make my excuses to the king. I am called to London on the most urgent business. Come, monsieur, we must make haste." The horses went like the wind, and within the hour they were at the gates of London. On entering the courtyard of his mansion, the Duke of Buckingham sprang from his horse and leaped for the door. D'Artagnan followed him up a long, wide staircase, and arrived at length in a bedroom which was a miracle of taste and richness. On a table was the casket that contained the diamond stud. The Duke of Buckingham opened the box and drew from it a large bow of blue ribbon, all sparkling with diamonds. "The Queen gave them to me, but the Queen requires them again," he said, "and so she must have them back." He looked down at the beautiful things, his face sad. All at once he uttered a terrible cry. "All is lost," he said, turning pale as a corpse. "2 of the studs are missing. There are only 10. "Can you have lost them, or have they been stolen?" asked D'Artagnan. "Stolen, without a doubt," returned the Duke of Buckingham bitterly. "Look, the ribbon was cut, and it is the cardinal who has dealt this blow. Let me think. The only time I have worn these studs was at the ball given by the king 8 days ago. Who was there? Let me think. Yes, I have it. The Comtesse de Winter came to make up a quarrel we had had. I have never seen her from that day. The Comtesse de Winter? Asked D'Artagnan. Yes, she is a woman of mystery, and an agent of the Cardinal's, I'll swear. She's French by birth, but was married to Lord de Winter until his death a year or two ago. There were some, I remember, who said that she had poisoned her husband. What does she look like? Asked D'Artagnan interestedly. She's fair, and very beautiful of face, if not of heart. D'Artagnan remembered the face seen at a carriage window. "Milady," he murmured to himself. "When is this ball to take place?" asked the Duke of Buckingham. "Monday next," returned D'Artagnan. "Monday next? Still 5 days before us. That's more time than we want." "Patrick," cried the Duke, opening the door of the room. The valet appeared. "My jeweller and my secretary," said Buckingham curtly. It was the secretary who arrived first. "Mr. Jackson," said the Duke, handing over some papers, "go at once to the Lord Chancellor and tell him that these orders must be carried out immediately." The secretary bowed and retired. "I have given an order that no ships are to leave England without written permission," said the Duke of Buckingham, turning to D'Artagnan. "If the studs are not yet gone to Paris, they will not arrive till after you." A moment later, the goldsmith entered. He was an Irishman, and one of the most skillful of his craft. "Mr. O'Reilly," said the Duke of Buckingham, "look at these diamond studs, and tell me how long you will need to make 2 more exactly like them." 8 days, my lord. You shall have 3,000 gold pieces if I have them by the day after tomorrow. My lord, they shall be yours. "And now," said the Duke of Buckingham, turning back to D'Artagnan, "what do you wish for? What do you desire?" "A bed, my lord," replied D'Artagnan promptly. "At present, that is the thing I need most." On the day after the morrow, by 11 o'clock, the diamond studs were finished, and they were so perfectly imitated, so perfectly alike, that the Duke of Buckingham could not tell the new ones from the old. He sent for D'Artagnan. "Here," he said, "here are the studs you came to fetch. You will tell the Queen that I have kept the casket, since it is all that is left to me. And now, how may I repay you for what you have done?" "Let us understand each other, my lord," replied D'Artagnan. "I am the servant of my Queen. I ask for no reward." "Very well," said the Duke of Buckingham. "Now listen carefully to what you must do. I have a ship waiting. It will take you to Saint-Valery on the French coast. There you will go to a mean tavern. Ask for the host and say to him the password, 'Forward.' He will give you a horse all saddled and will point out the road you ought to take. On the journey to Paris, you will stop at these 4 inns, whose names I have written here, and each time you will be given a fresh horse. If you leave your address with the landlords, the horses will follow you there. You will not refuse to accept one of them, I hope, and ask your 3 friends to accept the others." "Thank you, my lord," said D'Artagnan quietly. "You are most kind." D'Artagnan shook hands, bowed, and made his way to the riverside. Opposite the Tower of London, he found the vessel that had been named to him. He came to France, and 12 hours after leaving Saint-Valery, he arrived in Paris. It was 9 o'clock in the morning when he galloped into the yard of Monsieur de Tréville's headquarters. The captain of the Musketeers told him that Athos, Porthos, and Aramis were back in Paris, and that Aramis was all but recovered from his wound. He also informed him that he was on duty at the palace that day, and might at once take up his post. All Paris was talking about the ball which the aldermen of the city were giving for the king and queen. The main event was to be a performance of the king's favorite ballet, in which both he and his wife were to take part. In the afternoon, musketeers were posted in all the corridors of the town hall. At 6 in the evening, the guests began to gather, but it was not until midnight that cheering outside told of the arrival of the king. The alderman who met him at the door saw that he looked change into his costume for the ballet. The Queen arrived half an hour later, and it was remarked as she entered the great hall that she too looked dull and even weary. At the moment she entered, the curtain of a small gallery was drawn aside to reveal Cardinal Richelieu in the dress of a Spanish cavalier. His eyes were fixed upon the Queen, and a smile of terrible joy passed over his lips. The Queen was not wearing her diamond studs. The Queen stood for some time talking to the aldermen and their ladies. All at once the King appeared with the Cardinal at one of the doors of the hall. The Cardinal was speaking in a low voice, and the King was very pale. He made his way through the crowd with the ribbons of his doublet scarcely tied. He went straight to the Queen. "Madame, why are you not wearing your diamond studs?" he asked. The Queen saw the Cardinal behind him, a devilish smile on his face. "Sire," replied the Queen in a voice that shook, "I was afraid that I might lose them in such a large gathering as this." "What is the use of my giving you beautiful things if you do not wear them?" said the King. "I will send to the palace for them," the Queen replied, "if that will please your Majesty." "Do so, madame," said the King. "Very soon the ballet will begin." With that, the King returned to his dressing room, and his wife went to hers. The King was first to reappear. He was in a most elegant hunting costume, the dress that became him best. The Cardinal walked up to him and placed in his hand a small casket. The King opened it and found in it 2 diamond studs. "What does this mean?" he demanded. "Nothing," replied the Cardinal softly. "Only, if the Queen has her studs, count them, sire, and if you find only 10, ask Her Majesty who can have stolen from her the 2 studs that are here." The King looked at the Cardinal. Before he could speak, a loud murmur of admiration ran through the hall. The Queen had entered, dressed as a huntress in a gown of grey velvet. On her left shoulder glittered the diamond studs. The King trembled with joy, and the Cardinal with annoyance. But, distant as they were, they could not count the studs. The Queen was wearing them. The only question was, had she 10 or 12? At that moment, the violins sounded the signal for the ballet, and the King was forced to take his partner. He danced, facing the Queen, and every time he passed by her, he tried to count the studs. It was not possible, he found. A cold sweat covered the brow of the Cardinal. The ballet lasted 1 hour. As soon as it was done, the King advanced eagerly towards his wife. "Thank you, madame, for wearing these jewels," he said, "but I think 2 of them are missing, and I bring them back to you." He held out the 2 studs the Cardinal had given him. The Queen pretended to look surprised. "So, you are giving me 2 more?" she said. "I shall have 14. The Cardinal strolled up to them, while the King's anxious eyes counted the jewels upon the blue ribbon. The 12 studs were all there. The King turned upon Richelieu. "What does this mean?" he demanded angrily. The Cardinal smiled with his lips, though not with his eyes. "It means, sire," he replied smoothly, "that I wish to present the Queen with these 2 studs, and since I did not dare to offer them myself, I adopted this method of inducing her to accept them." The Queen, knowing how little truth his words contained, smiled at him and said, "I am all the more grateful to your Eminence, since I am certain that these 2 studs alone have cost you as much as all the others cost His Majesty." It was after 3 o'clock in the morning when D'Artagnan reached home. He knocked softly upon the door. Planchet opened it for him. "I found a letter on the table in your bedroom," said the servant. "Where is it now?" "Still where I found it." It was from Constance Bonacieux, and it said, "There are many things to be offered to you. Be this evening about 10 o'clock at Saint-Cloud, in front of the pavilion which stands at the corner of the house of Monsieur d'Estrées, initialed C.B." D'Artagnan's heart swelled with joy. He read and reread his letter 20 times. At length he went to bed, fell asleep, and had golden dreams. At 9 that night, D'Artagnan rode off from his lodging, mounted on one of the 4 horses presented to him by the Duke of Buckingham. He had his sword and 2 pistols in his belt. When he reached Saint-Cloud, he turned into a quiet lane and soon found himself in front of the pavilion named in the letter. It stood in a very quiet spot. A high wall, at the angle of which was the pavilion, ran along one side of this lane, and on the other was a poor cottage protected by a hedge from passers-by. D'Artagnan leaned against the hedge and waited. In a few minutes, the belfry of Saint-Cloud let fall slowly 10 strokes from its sonorous jaws. All the windows of the pavilion were shuttered except one on the first story. Through this window shone a mild light, silvering the leaves of 2 or 3 trees which stood outside the wall. The clock of Saint-Cloud struck 10:30. D'Artagnan started to pace up and down, growing uneasy at this silence and this solitude. 11 o'clock sounded. D'Artagnan hurried down to the lane. He turned to the cottage and beat heavily upon the door until an old worm-eaten shutter was pushed ajar and a light shone through. D'Artagnan had a glimpse of an old man's head. "Listen to me," said D'Artagnan. "I had arranged to meet a young woman before that pavilion there. She did not come. I'm dying with anxiety. You live so close. Have you seen anything?" The old man nodded. "Sir," he said, "about 9 o'clock I heard a noise in the lane. I went out. There were 3 men at the gate, and under the tree was a coach and some saddle horses. They asked me if I had a ladder. I said, 'Yes, I have a ladder.' 'Well, lend it to us. There is a crown for the trouble we cause you.' Well, I gave them the ladder, then pretended to go into the house again, but I went out the back door and hid behind a tree. The 3 men took out of the carriage a short, stout, elderly man dressed in dark clothes. He climbed the ladder very quietly, looked in at the window of the pavilion, came down again and whispered, 'It is she.' Immediately, the one who had spoken to me disappeared into the pavilion, while the other 2 men mounted the ladder. All at once, there came loud screams from the pavilion. A woman ran to the window and opened it, as if to throw herself out. As soon as she saw the 2 men, she sprang back, and they climbed into the room. I heard screams and cries and the noise of breaking furniture. 2 of the men appeared, carrying the woman in their arms. They put her in the carriage. The carriage then went off at a rapid pace. And that, sir, was all." "Did you see clearly the man who was the leader?" asked D'Artagnan. "What did he look like?" "A tall, dark man, sir, with a mark on his left cheek." It was 7 in the morning when D'Artagnan reached his lodging. On approaching the house, he saw Bonacieux standing at his door. "Well," he said, "we appear to pass rather busy nights. 7 in the morning, eh? Where were you last night? Look at your boots." D'Artagnan glanced down at his boots, all covered with mud, but that same glance fell upon the shoes and stockings of Bonacieux. Both were stained with splashes of mud of the same appearance. The idea came to D'Artagnan. It was obviously Bonacieux who had been called upon to identify Constance. Here stood the man who had found a way to read the note sent by his wife to D'Artagnan, and who had betrayed her to the cardinal. D'Artagnan was tempted to grasp him by the throat and strangle him, but he forced himself to smile. The same night, the 3 friends sat in D'Artagnan's apartment. They nodded gloomily. "We should have foreseen that something like this would happen," said Athos. D'Artagnan started to his feet. "She must be rescued," he said. "She shall be rescued," said Athos quietly. "But we must remember that we are pitting our wits against the most powerful man in France. We need help in high places." "The Queen," said Aramis suddenly. The others turned to look at him. "I am acquainted with a lady who is close to the Queen," said Aramis, a little stiffly. "Aha!" said Porthos roguishly, wagging a large forefinger at his friend. D'Artagnan remembered a certain lady's handkerchief with a coronet sewn in one corner, remembered also that it was a woman to whom Constance Bonacieux had spoken at the window of Aramis's lodging. "Aramis has hit upon the right idea," said Athos approvingly. "The king and queen have been much closer of late. Perhaps even he may be persuaded to help us. Now, Aramis, how shall we send this message, and how long before it reaches the queen?" Aramis rose and reached for his cloak. "The message shall be delivered by word of mouth," he said, "and will reach the queen within the hour." 3 days passed, 3 days of agony for D'Artagnan. On the evening of the 3rd day, Aramis arrived. "Constance Bonacieux is safe and well," he said. "Where is she?" asked D'Artagnan. "In the prison of Mantes. That is to say, she was there, but the queen has obtained an order from the king, by means of which she is to be conveyed to a convent." "Which convent?" asked D'Artagnan eagerly. "I don't know. The queen insists that it be kept a secret until she knows that Constance Bonacieux is safely there." 5 more days passed, and then, in the evening, and at almost the same hour, Aramis came again, waving a paper in his hand. "Here is a letter from my cousin," he said, "and it contains information that you will be glad to hear." D'Artagnan snatched the letter from his hand and read, "My dear cousin, I think you should set out for Béthune, where my sister in the convent of the Carmelites. Here is the authorization from my sister to withdraw the girl from the convent, the air of which you think is bad for her. Adieu, my dear cousin. Tell us news of yourself as soon as you are able. I embrace you. Sign, my Michon." With this letter had come the following order. "At the Louvre, October 12, 1626, the superior of the convent of Béthune will place in the hands of the person who shall present this note to her, the novice who entered the convent upon my recommendation and under my patronage, signed by the queen." "How much I owe to you, Aramis," said D'Artagnan, looking up. "Constance Bonacieux is safe at Béthune. Fortune smiles upon me. Let us set out at once." He threw the letter upon the table and turned to the door. "Not so fast," cried Aramis with a laugh. "We do not need to kill ourselves to reach Béthune. Well, let us at least go now and inform Athos what has happened. Planchet shall run to Porthos's lodging and tell him to join us as soon as he can. The 4 of us must celebrate." This happy atmosphere would not have prevailed if D'Artagnan had been aware of a message which had winged its way from Boulogne to Paris a few days earlier. It read as follows: "To His Eminence, Monseigneur the Cardinal Richelieu. Monseigneur, let your Eminence be reassured. The matter which took me to England has been satisfactorily concluded. According to the desire of your Eminence, I will report to the convent of the Carmelites at Béthune, where I will await your orders. Signed, Milady." In response, the cardinal sent the Count de Rochefort to visit her, and these 2 demoniacal tools of his Eminence greeted each other warmly. "What have you been doing?" Rochefort asked. "I have not wasted my time," Milady answered. "I don't doubt that," he said. "Do you know whom I have encountered there?" she said. "No," he said. "That young woman whom the queen took out of prison," she said. "The mistress of that fellow D'Artagnan," he said. "Yes, Constance Bonacieux. The cardinal did not know where she had got to," she said. "Well, well," said Rochefort, "here is a chance." "Imagine my astonishment," continued Milady, "when I found myself face to face with her." "Does she know you?" he said. "No," she said. "Then she looks upon you as a stranger," he said. "I am already her best friend," she said. "Upon my honor," said Rochefort. "It takes you, my dear Countess, to perform such miracles." "And it is well that I can," said Milady. "For do you know what is going on here?" "No," he said. "They will come for her tomorrow or the day after, with an order from the queen," she said. "Who will come?" he said. "D'Artagnan and his friend," she said. "But is this little woman, then, to escape his Eminence?" he said. "My dear Rochefort," said Milady with a smile that belonged only to herself, "you forget that I am her best friend." "Ah, that's true. I may then tell the cardinal, with respect to this little woman, that he may be at ease," she said. "Is that all?" he said. "He will know what Now, what would you have me do, he asked. Return instantly and report to the cardinal, she answered. Then, if his eminence is agreeable, return to my side. Will you be here, he asked. Indeed I won't, she answered. I will have taken up residence at Armentières. Where is that, he asked. A little town on the river Lys, she answered. I only have to cross the river, and I shall be in a foreign country, should danger arise. Write that name on a bit of paper, lest I should forget it, said Rochefort. Milady did so. Rochefort took the paper and placed it in the lining of his hat. D'Artagnan, his friends, and their 4 servants left Paris at 5 the next morning. The others let him set his own mad pace. Relays of fast horses carried them as far as Arras, where Athos insisted that they eat a meal. As the 4 approached the inn and dismounted, a horseman came out of the post-yard and took the road for Paris. At the moment he passed through the gateway into the street, the wind lifted his hat, which he seized with his hand the moment it left his head and pulled hard down over his eyes. "It's my man of Mans, cried D'Artagnan. "I recognized him. To saddle, gentlemen. Let us pursue him." "My dear friend," said Aramis, "remember that he has a fresh horse, and ours are fatigued. We have no chance of overtaking him. Furthermore, he is going in the opposite direction to us." "Monsieur, monsieur!" cried an ostler, running out and looking after the man of Mans. "Monsieur, a paper dropped out of your hat." "A gold piece for that paper," said D'Artagnan. "With great pleasure, here it is, monsieur," cried the enchanted ostler. D'Artagnan unfolded the paper. "Well?" eagerly demanded his 3 friends. "Nothing but one word," said D'Artagnan. "Yes," said Aramis, "the name of some town or village." "Armentières," read Porthos. "Armentières. I don't know such a place, but I seem to know that handwriting," mused Athos. "We are both in deadly danger," said Milady. Constance Bonacieux raised her hand to her mouth and gasped. "What has happened?" she asked. "My visitor," said Milady, "who was my brother. He brought me news that the cardinal, who has persecuted me across the length and breadth of France, continues to dog my footsteps. He knows I'm here. He knows you're here. His emissaries, disguised as musketeers, are now on their way here to arrest us." "But D'Artagnan is coming," sighed Constance Bonacieux. "He may well be too late," said Milady gravely. "Oh, my God, my senses fail me," said Constance Bonacieux, raising her hands to her forehead. "What then to do? What then to do?" "Come with me," replied Milady. "There is a place of my husband's where we may hide till D'Artagnan is able to join us. My carriage is waiting." "Yes, you are right," cried Constance Bonacieux. "Let us go at once." "Drink a finger of wine before we leave," said Milady. "It will steady you." She poured wine into 2 of the glasses that stood upon the table and handed one to Constance Bonacieux. She lifted her glass to her lips, and then her hand remained suspended. She had heard something on the road which sounded like the far-off beat of hoofs approaching. Her eyes narrowed, and she ran to the window. "Oh, my God!" said Constance, trembling. "What is that noise?" "It may be our enemies," said Milady. "Stay where you are." The noise became louder. Milady gazed out along a stretch of road that lay like white ribbon in the moonlight. All at once, at the turning of the road, she saw the glitter of laced hats and the waving of feathers. She counted 2, then 5, then 8 horsemen. One of them led the rest, by double the length of his horse. Milady gave a little groan. She had recognized D'Artagnan. A livid flash of hatred darted from her eyes. She ran to the table and poured into Constance Bonacieux's glass of wine the contents of a ring, which she opened with singular quickness. From it fell a pellet of a reddish color. It melted instantly. Milady lifted the glass with a firm hand and said, "Drink. This wine will give you strength." She put the glass to the lips of the young woman, who drank mechanically. "This is not the way I wished to avenge myself," said Milady to herself, "but one must do what one can." She set the glass on the table and rushed out of the room. Moments later, a figure flitted across the garden and disappeared through a gate into a wood. Constance Bonacieux rose to her fear without the power of moving. A few moments passed. A great noise was heard at the gate. Boots and spurs sounded on the stairs. The door burst open. Several men rushed into the room. D'Artagnan saw beside the chair in which Constance Bonacieux sat. She looked at him like a woman who dreams. "You've come," she said. Yes, said D'Artagnan gently. "All is well now." "She said you wouldn't come in time." "She? What she?" asked D'Artagnan. "Why, my companion. She was so beautiful. Oh, my God. My head swims. I cannot see. Quickly, her hands are icy cold," said D'Artagnan. She's ill. Bring me water." Aramis ran to the table. He stopped at the sight of the horrible alteration that had taken place in the face of Athos, who, standing before the table, was looking at one of the glasses and appeared a prey to the most horrible doubt. "Ah," said Athos softly. "No, it is impossible. God would not permit such a crime." Constance Bonacieux opened her eyes. Athos walked towards her. "Madame," he said gently, holding out the fatal glass, "in the name of heaven, whose empty glass is this?" "Mine, monsieur," replied the young woman in a weak voice. "But who poured the wine for you?" She called herself the Comtesse de Winter." The four friends uttered one and the same cry, but that of Athos dominated the rest. At that moment, the face of Constance Bonacieux became livid. Her body shook with a fearful agony, and she sank, panting, into the arms of Porthos and Aramis. D'Artagnan seized Athos by the hand. "What do you think?" he asked hoarsely. Athos spoke one word. "Poison." "D'Artagnan, where are you?" cried Constance Bonacieux. "Do not leave me. Do not leave me. I'm dying." D'Artagnan hurried to her. Her face was distorted. A shudder shook her body. The sweat stood on her brow. "In heaven's name, run! Call for help!" cried D'Artagnan. "Useless," murmured Athos. "For the poison which she pours, there is no antidote." Then, collecting all her strength, Constance Bonacieux took the young man's head between her hands, looked at him for an instant, as if her whole soul had passed into that look, and pressed her lips to his, and she died. D'Artagnan gave a little cry, and held her tighter still. Athos made a sign to Porthos and Aramis to go and fetch the abbess. The two friends met her in the corridor, and led her to the room where Athos waited. "Madame," he said gently, passing his arm under that of D'Artagnan, "we leave to your care the body of this unfortunate young lady. Treat her as one of your sisters." Followed by their servants, the Musketeers rode silently and mournfully to the town of Bethune, where Athos drew rein before an inn. "Are we not to pursue that woman?" asked D'Artagnan. "Later," said Athos. "There are things that must first be done." "She will escape us," replied the young man hotly, "and it will be your fault, Athos." "I shall find her," said Athos calmly, with great confidence. "D'Artagnan, give me the paper which fell from that man's hat. Let us see if there is still a God in heaven." Athos begged the host to get him a map of the area, and saw that there were 4 different roads from Bethune to Armentières. He called the servants and spoke to them for some time, giving them his orders. They were to set out next morning at dawn and go to Armentières, each by a different route. All 4 were to meet next day at 11 o'clock. If they had discovered Milady's hiding place, 3 were to remain on guard. The 4th was to return to Bethune to inform Athos. When these arrangements were made, the servants retired, and Athos shut himself up in his room. Early next morning, D'Artagnan came to him and asked what was to be done. "Wait," replied Athos. An hour later, the abbess of the convent sent word that the burial would take place at midday. At the appointed hour, the 4 friends arrived at the convent. The bells were tolling, the chapel was opened, and in it lay the body of the victim. clothed in a white robe. At the door of the chapel, D'Artagnan felt his courage fail him and turned to look for Athos, but Athos had disappeared. He had asked to be led to the garden, and there upon the soft earth he followed the steps of a woman who left sharp tracks wherever she went. They advanced towards a gate which led into a small wood. Athos passed through the wood and out onto a road. The ground had been trampled by horses. Her carriage had waited here for Milady, who had come out of the wood to enter it. Athos returned to the inn and found Planchet waiting for him. Planchet, like Athos, had followed the road by the wood and noted the spot where the horses had halted. The tracks of the carriage had led him on to Armentières. There was but one hotel, the Post. Planchet had not chatted 10 minutes with the people of the inn before he learned that a woman had arrived in a carriage the previous night. The woman had taken a room, sent for the host, and told him that she wished to remain some time in the neighborhood. Planchet did not need to know more. He found the other 3 servants, placed them as sentries at all the doors of the hotel, and came to find Athos as planned. He was finishing his report when the 3 friends returned, their faces sad and gloomy. "What is to be done?" asked D'Artagnan. "Wait," replied Athos calmly. Each one went to his own room. Athos called for his horse, rode quickly to the city of Lille, some 20 miles distant. Arrived there, he stabled his horse and walked out into the streets. Several times he stopped and asked people the way, and each time they seemed to recoil from him in a kind of terror, and only answered him by pointing. At last he arrived at a small house, isolated, solitary, and dismal. The walls were painted red, as was the front door itself. Athos knocked twice without answer. At the 3rd knock, however, the door was opened, and a man appeared. He was tall and pale, with black hair and beard. Athos spoke to him in a low voice, and the man made a sign that he might come in. Athos sat down upon a chair and explained the cause of his visit. The man drew back with signs of terror and shook his head as if in refusal. Then Athos mentioned a name. The man started, and a strange light entered his eyes. Athos talked on. The man nodded from time to time, and at last bowed to show that he was ready to obey. When Athos rode back to Béthune, the tall man rode at his side until they reached the town where Athos left him at the tavern. Back at his own inn, Athos ordered a fresh horse for himself, then called his friends and told them that time had come for their expedition. In a matter of minutes, all 3 were ready and waiting below. Athos was last to come down, and found D'Artagnan already on horseback and growing impatient. "Patience," cried Athos. "One of our party is still missing." The 3 looked at each other in astonishment, and at this moment Planchet brought Athos's horse. He leaped lightly into the saddle. "Wait for me," he said. "I will soon be back," and set off at a gallop. Inside 10 minutes he returned, riding by the side of a tall man who was masked and wrapped in a large red cloak. Again the Musketeers looked at each other inquiringly. Athos said nothing, however, and guided by Planchet, the little cavalcade set out on the road to Armentières. The night was dark and stormy. From time to time, a flash of lightning revealed the road, white and empty. Then all was darkness once more. The storm increased. The flashes came more rapidly. Thunder began to growl, and the wind whistled in the plumes and the hair of the horsemen. When they were still 3 miles from Armentières, the storm burst. They spread their cloaks and rode on amid torrents of rain. As they entered Armentières, a man stepped out into the middle of the road and raised an arm. Athos recognized his servant, Grimaud. "What's the matter?" he asked sharply. "Has she left Armentières?" "Yes," replied Grimaud, and D'Artagnan ground his teeth. "Where is she?" asked Athos. Grimaud pointed toward the river Lys. "Within half a mile of us, in the direction of the river," he said. "Very well," said D'Artagnan grimly. "Lead us." The troop continued on their way. Some minutes passed. Another flash illuminated all around them. Grimaud stretched out his arm, and by the blue light of the fiery serpent they saw a lonely little house on the banks of the river, within 100 paces of a ferry. One window was lighted. At this moment, a man who had been crouching in a ditch jumped up. It was Mousqueton, the servant of Porthos. "She is there," he said. "Good," said Athos quietly. "You have done well." He leaped down from his horse and went towards the window. He mounted the skirting stone and peered over the curtain. By the light of the lamp he saw a woman wrapped in a dark cloak, seated upon a stool near a dying fire. Her elbows were placed upon a mean table, and she leaned her head upon her two hands. He could not make out her face, but he knew it was she whom he sought. Milady, for it was her, raised her head and saw close to the panes the pale face of Athos. She screamed. Athos pushed the window with his knee and hand. The squares were broken into shivers, and Athos, like a spectre of vengeance, sprang into the room. Milady rushed to the door and opened it. Paler and more menacing than Athos, D'Artagnan stood on the threshold, a pistol in his hand. Milady drew back with a cry of fear. "Put away that pistol, D'Artagnan," said Athos sharply. "Come in, gentlemen." D'Artagnan put his pistol in his belt. Behind him entered Porthos, Aramis, and the man in the red cloak. The servants guarded the door and window. Milady had sunk into a chair, pale and wide-eyed. "What do you want?" she screamed suddenly. "To judge you according to your crimes," said Athos solemnly. "You shall be free to defend yourself. Monsieur d'Artagnan, it is for you to accuse her first." D'Artagnan stepped forward. "Before God and before men," he said, "I accuse this woman of poisoning Constance Bonacieux, who died yesterday." His voice broke on the last words. Athos turned towards Porthos and Aramis. "We bear witness to this," they said in one voice. "My turn," said Athos, who turned strangely pale. "Gentlemen, I know this woman better than anyone here. She is my wife." His three friends gasped and stared at him in horror. Milady had buried her face in her hands. "Yes, I married this woman when she was a girl of 16, and as beautiful as an angel. She lived in a small town with her brother, who was a vicar. Both had recently come into the country of which I was the lord. Nobody knew where they came from, but she was so lovely, and her brother so good, that nobody even thought of asking. I married her in opposition to the wishes of my family. I gave her my wealth, I gave her my name, I took her into my chateau, and made her the first lady of those parts. As the months passed, I began to discover that the angel face hid the heart of a monster." Athos paused, and a twisted smile came to his lips. "One day, gentlemen," he continued, "she fell from her horse and fainted. I flew to help her. As she fell, she had ripped the shoulder of her gown, and I saw that she was branded. She was marked with the fleur-de-lis on her left shoulder. She had been branded as a common thief. From her own lips I learned that she had stolen the sacred vessels from a church." Again he paused, and there was a little shocked silence. "Merciful heavens, what are you telling us?" whispered Aramis. "The truth," said Athos quietly. "I was a great noble. I had on my estates the right of life and death. I tied her hands behind her, and hanged her on a tree, and left her. As you see, my friends, I am not skilled in such things. She did not die, although I believed her dead." "Are you sure that this is the same woman?" asked Porthos, staring at Milady in horror. "See for yourself," said Athos, and in one quick stride he was beside Milady and had ripped the cloak from her back. She tried to escape, but he swung her around and tore the lace from her beautiful shoulders, and on one of those lovely shoulders D'Artagnan recognized the fleur-de-lis, the mark of the executioner. gave a cry of fury. She looked at Athos with eyes full of hate. "I defy you," she said. "I defy you to find any tribunal which convicted me of anything. I defy you to find the man who branded me." "Silence," said a deep and hollow voice. "I will reply to that." The man in the red cloak took a step forward, then lifted a hand and removed his mask. Milady stared at his face, and her eyes filled with terror. She started back from him. "Oh, no, 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 no," she screamed. "But who are you, then?" they all cried. Milady gave one more scream of terror. "The executioner of Lille," she cried wildly. "He is the executioner of Lille." Everyone drew back, and the man in the red cloak remained alone in the middle of the room. "Forgive me," cried the wretched woman, falling on her knees. The executioner waited for silence. When he spoke, all eyes were fixed upon him. All ears listened with anxious attention to his words. "That woman," he said, "was once a young girl, as beautiful as she is now. She took vows as a nun in the convent of the Benedictines at Templemar. A young priest who was chaplain of that convent fell in love with her, and she induced him to leave the country. But to escape to another part of France, money was necessary. She stole the sacred vessels, and the priest sold them. Before they could escape, however, they were both arrested. Within a week, the son of the prison jailer had fallen madly in love with her and helped her to escape. The priest was sentenced to 10 years in chains and to be branded. I was executioner of Lille, as this woman has said. I branded the guilty man, and that man, gentlemen, was my brother. I then swore that the woman who had ruined him should at least share his punishment. I suspected where she was concealed. I followed her, I caught her, I bound her, and I placed on her shoulder the same brand with which I had marked my brother. The day after I returned to Lille, my brother in his turn succeeded in making his escape. I was accused of helping him and condemned to take his place in prison until he was recaptured. He, of course, knew nothing of this. He had rejoined this woman. They fled together into Berry, and there he was given a curacy. This woman passed for his sister. The lord of that country fell in love with her and offered her to marry her. She left the man she had ruined and became the Comtesse de la Fère. All eyes turned to Athos, who made a sign for the executioner to go on. My brother, he continued, was heartbroken. He came back to Lille, learned of the sentence that had condemned me in his place, and gave himself up. That same night, he hanged himself from the iron bar of the loophole of his cell. I was then set free. That is the crime of which I accuse this woman. That is why she was branded. Monsieur d'Artagnan, said Athos sternly, what penalty do you demand against this woman? The punishment of death, replied D'Artagnan. Messieurs Porthos and Aramis, Athos went on, you who are her judges, what penalty do you pronounce on this woman? The punishment of death, replied the Musketeers as one. Milady uttered a frightful shriek and dragged herself forward on her knees towards her judges. Athos stretched out his hands towards her. Your crimes, he said slowly, have wearied men on earth and God in heaven. If you know a prayer, say it, for you are condemned, and you shall die. Milady rose to her feet and tried to speak, but no words came. The executioner took her arm. She made no resistance, but let herself be led from the cottage. The musketeers followed. The servants came behind their masters, and the room was left empty, with its broken windows, its open door, and its smoky lamp burning sadly on the table. It was now just after midnight. The moon, as red as blood under the last traces of the storm, showed the musketeers the waters of the Lys like a river of molten tin. On the far bank, black mass of trees were outlined against the stormy skies. When they reached the banks of the river, the executioner bound Milady's hands and feet. "You are not judges," shrieked Milady. "You cannot condemn me." "You condemned Constance Bonacieux," said D'Artagnan. Milady uttered a cry of terror and sank upon her knees. The executioner took her up in his arms and carried her to the ferryboat, which was moored at that spot. "Oh, my God," she cried, "are you going to drown me?" He placed Milady in the boat, which began to glide along the ferry rope. Those who were left dropped silently to their knees. They saw the boat reach the other bank. The figures were outlined in black against the red-tinted sky. They saw the executioner raise both his arms slowly. A moonbeam fell upon the blade of his sword. The two arms fell with sudden force. The victim gave one little cry. 3 days later, the 4 Musketeers were in Paris again. That same evening, they called upon Monsieur de Tréville. "Well, gentlemen," he asked, "have you enjoyed your excursion?" "Prodigiously," replied Athos. D'Artagnan sat brooding over a bottle of wine. There came the sound of boots and spurs upon the stairs. There was a sharp rap at the door, which was then pushed open. The man who stood upon the threshold darted a searching glance into the room, and his eyes settled upon D'Artagnan, who sprang to his feet with a cry of joy. It was the man he called his phantom, the dark stranger of Meun. Yes, the man of Meun. D'Artagnan drew his sword and sprang eagerly forward. "I meet you at last," he cried. "This time you shall not escape." "This is not my intention, monsieur," replied the man from Meun. "This time I'm seeking you." "Who are you, then?" demanded D'Artagnan. "I am the Comte de Rochefort, and I have orders to conduct you to his eminence. Now, monsieur, your sword, if you please." He held out a hand. For a moment, D'Artagnan hesitated. Then his eyes gleamed with a spark they had not shown for some weeks. He handed over his sword and made a bow. "I will go with you," he said lightly. The cardinal looked up, made a sign for Rochefort to retire, then stared intently at the young man for a long moment of time. "Monsieur," he said then, "you have been arrested by my orders. Do you know why?" "No, monseigneur. The only thing for which I could be arrested is still unknown to your eminence." "You have done many things in these last few months," the cardinal continued thoughtfully. "And now, monsieur, you are charged with corresponding with enemies of the kingdom, the Duke of Buckingham, for instance." "And who charges me with this, monseigneur?" asked D'Artagnan calmly. "The only person, a woman, who might accuse me of any crime has herself been punished." The cardinal looked surprised. "Of what woman do you speak?" he asked. "Of Milady, the Comtesse de la Fère." The cardinal's eyes narrowed at the name. "And who has punished her?" he demanded. "We, that is, my friends and myself." "Is she in prison, then?" he asked. "She is dead," D'Artagnan answered. "Dead?" repeated the cardinal, as if he could not believe his ears. "Did you say she was dead?" "She murdered the woman I loved. We took her, tried her, and condemned her," said D'Artagnan. And he told of the poisoning of Constance Bonacieux, of the trial in the lonely house, and the execution on the banks of the river Lys. A shudder crept through the body of the cardinal, who did not shudder readily. At length he raised his head, fixed his eagle look upon the young man before him, and reflected not for the first time of what value his courage, his activity, and his shrewdness might be to a good master. On the other hand, Milady's crimes and her strength of mind had more than once terrified him. He knew the evil that had been in her, and though shocked by the manner of her death, he was even more shocked to think of the wanton way she had murdered Constance Bonacieux. He took up a pen, wrote a few lines on a paper, 2/3 of which was filled up and affixed his seal to it. "It will be the Bastille for me, at least," thought D'Artagnan ruefully. "Take this," said the cardinal abruptly. D'Artagnan took the paper, stared at it with unbelieving eyes. It was a lieutenant's commission in the Musketeers. D'Artagnan dropped to one knee. "Monseigneur," he said, "I do not deserve this favor. I have 3 friends who are more worthy." "You are a brave man, Monsieur D'Artagnan," interrupted the cardinal, smiling. "I like men of head and heart. Do with this commission what you will. Only remember that though the name is blank, I gave it to you." "I shall never forget it," replied D'Artagnan. "Your Eminence, be certain of that." The cardinal turned and said in a loud voice, "Rochefort!" The Comte de Rochefort entered immediately. "Rochefort," said the cardinal, "you see, Monsieur D'Artagnan, I count him as a friend from this moment on. Shake hands, then, and behave yourselves, the pair of you, if you value your heads." Under the cardinal's eagle eye, the 2 shook hands and greeted each other. They left the room at the same time. "We shall meet again, shall we not, monsieur?" said Rochefort, as soon as the door was closed. "When you please," replied D'Artagnan. "An opportunity will come," said Rochefort. "Take care," said the cardinal, opening the door. The 2 men smiled at each other, shook hands, and bowed to his Eminence. D'Artagnan hurried with all speed to the lodging of Athos, whom he found emptying a bottle of wine. He told what had taken place between the cardinal and himself, then held out the commission, saying, "This, of course, belongs to you, Athos." Athos smiled and shook his head. "My friend," he said, "for Athos this is too much. For the Comte de la Fère it is too little. Keep it. It is yours. It has cost you enough." D'Artagnan left Athos, went to Porthos's lodging. He found the big musketeer dressed in a magnificent suit of clothes, looking at himself in a looking-glass. "Well," he demanded, "how does this suit me?" "Very well," replied D'Artagnan, "but I come to offer you a dress which will suit you even better, that of a lieutenant of musketeers." He told his tale again, and once more offered the commission. Porthos waved it aside. "My dear fellow," he said, "that is of no use to me. During our expedition to Béthune, a certain duchess of my acquaintance lost her husband. When sufficient time has elapsed, I shall be married to her. Look here, I'm trying on my wedding suit. Write your own name on the commission, for I have done with soldiering." D'Artagnan then hurried to Aramis. He found him kneeling before a praying desk, with his head on an open prayer book. For the 3rd time, D'Artagnan told his tale and offered the commission. Aramis waved it away. "D'Artagnan," he said, "I have for some time felt drawn towards the church. Our recent adventures have left me disgusted with the life of the sword. I have made up my mind to take holy orders. Keep this commission, D'Artagnan. You will make a brave and gallant captain." D'Artagnan went back to Athos, whom he found looking into a glass of wine by the light of his lamp. "Well," said Athos with a smile, "so they too have refused this commission." And he took up a pen, wrote the name of D'Artagnan on the paper, and returned it to him. "I gain this," said D'Artagnan sadly, "but it seems that I shall see little of my friends any more. I shall be left with only bitter memories." He let his head sink upon his hands, while 2 large tears rolled down his cheeks. "You are young," replied Athos, "and all your bitter memories have time to be changed into sweet ones." D'Artagnan took possession of his command. Porthos left the service, and in the course of the following year married his rich widow. Aramis, after a journey into Lorraine, disappeared all at once and ceased to write to his friends. They learned at a later period that he had entered a monastery, only into which nobody knew. Athos remained a musketeer under the command of D'Artagnan till the year 1633, when he too left the service and retired to a small property in the country. D'Artagnan fought 3 times with Rochefort and wounded him 3 times. I shall probably kill you the fourth time, he said, as he helped the wounded man to rise. Then it is better for me that we stop here, answered Rochefort with a grimace, and let us be friends indeed. Bonacieux lived on very quietly, without knowing what had become of his wife, and caring very little about it. One day he was foolish enough to recall himself to the memory of the cardinal. The next day Bonacieux left his house at 7 in the evening, and was never seen